The terror of silence. There's a kind of power no one ever teaches you how to use. It doesn't roar. It doesn't argue. It doesn't need to be seen. This power lives in the quiet, the deliberate kind of silence that unsettles rooms, exposes masks, and refuses to perform. Friedrich Nietzsche once wrote, "The higher we soar, the smaller we appear to those who cannot fly." In a world obsessed with being loud, with broadcasting every thought, with staying visible at all costs, the silent individual becomes a mystery. And in that mystery lies something terrifying, because what we can't define, we can't control. When you stop reacting, when you stop explaining yourself, when you walk into a room and choose stillness over performance, people feel it. Not because you're intimidating, but because your silence makes them confront something they've been trying to avoid themselves. In today's world, where visibility equals value, silence becomes rebellion. It says, "I do not owe you access. I do not need to be understood. I know who I am." Nietzsche didn't romanticize silence as weakness or withdrawal. He saw it as concentrated will, the highest form of inner control. It's what happens when a person no longer needs approval to feel real. When someone has overcome the need to perform, they become untouchable. And that's what makes them dangerous. Not because they're loud, but because they aren't. Not because they demand attention, but because they don't. In this video, we're going to explore that power. We'll dive into Nietzsche's radical view of strength, not the strength that shouts, but the strength that waits, that observes, that holds back until the moment is right. You'll learn why the quiet ones are often the most terrifying, and more importantly, how you can become one of them. Because in a world that never shuts up, silence isn't just rare, it's revolutionary. Why silence threatens the herd. In most social settings, silence doesn't go unnoticed, it gets labeled. You're called distant, awkward, cold, or even arrogant. But the truth is, silence doesn't bother others because it's quiet. It bothers them because it's unreadable. We live in a culture shaped by performance, where people signal who they are through speech, opinion, reaction. And so, when someone doesn't play that game, it throws the whole system off balance. Nietzsche saw this centuries ago. He understood that society isn't afraid of what it can see, it's afraid of what it cannot predict. That's why the quiet individual, the one who doesn't respond, doesn't explain, and doesn't seek attention, becomes a silent threat to the herd. Human beings are deeply wired for social mirroring. In evolutionary terms, we survive by aligning with the group, interpreting facial expressions, mimicking emotions, and conforming to shared behavior. The silent person disrupts this code. Without feedback, there's no map. Without reaction, there's no mirror. So instead of understanding them, people project their own insecurities onto them. They assume you're judging, superior, or disconnected, when in fact you're simply grounded. That's the irony. The more at peace you are, the more unsettled others feel around you. Nietzsche called this resistance to the group the path of the higher individual. He believed that true strength wasn't found in acceptance, but in the courage to stand apart. But standing apart has a cost. It's lonely. It's uncomfortable. It invites misunderstanding. And yet, it's also the only way to transcend the shallow games of status and validation. When you no longer need to be interpreted, you become untouchable. Not because you've built walls, but because you've stopped making yourself available for manipulation. The herd wants predictability. It wants to label you, categorize you, reduce you to something familiar. But when you don't respond, when you don't flinch, when you simply watch, they can't place you. That uncertainty feels like a threat, not because you are dangerous, but because you remind them of their lack of control. You become the glitch in their emotional matrix. And so, silence becomes a kind of pressure. A quiet force that collapses the performative scaffolding people rely on to feel in control. This is why people are uncomfortable with the silent ones. Not because they're doing anything wrong, but because their stillness exposes just how performative everyone else is. In a room full of noise, the one who listens becomes the most powerful presence. They hold space. They observe. And when they finally speak, every word lands like a weight. So the next time someone labels you as too quiet, remember this: what they call silence might just be your sovereignty. In a world that equates noise with power, choosing stillness isn't weakness. It's a form of leadership, quiet leadership, inner strength, the kind Nietzsche believed could shape the future. What role does silence play in your life right now? Comment below with a moment when your silence spoke louder than words. Attention is not value. In today's culture, being noticed has become synonymous with being valuable. You're told that if you're not posting, performing, or speaking up, you're falling behind. Social media has turned visibility into currency. The number of views, likes, followers, these are the metrics that shape self-worth. But Nietzsche would have seen this for what it really is: spiritual decay. Because when attention becomes the goal, authenticity dies in the process. What you project becomes more important than who you are. And the cost of that trade is your soul. Nietzsche warned about this over a century ago through the figure he called the last man. The last man isn't a villain. He's not evil. He's worse. He's comfortable. He avoids pain, avoids depth, avoids risk. He doesn't strive, doesn't confront, doesn't evolve. Instead, he seeks applause, distraction, and safety. He is always visible, but never truly seen. Today, the last man tweets his outrage, curates his image, buys his identity. He consumes endlessly and believes that attention equals existence. But Nietzsche's true warning is this: when you build your value on how others respond to you, you've already surrendered your power. This is where the silent archetype enters, not as a passive figure, but as a radical alternative. A person who does not crave eyes on them to feel whole, who does not rush to post, explain, or declare. They are not driven by being seen, they are driven by becoming. That's the difference. The herd celebrates expression, but Nietzsche admired what he called the becoming, a process of inner refinement, not outer reaction. It's about evolving inwardly, often in solitude, without needing recognition as fuel. Western culture, especially American culture, idolizes visibility. We're taught to speak up, market ourselves, build a brand. But Nietzsche flips the script. He challenges the very foundation of that belief. He's asking, who are you when no one is watching? What are you without your audience, your followers, your praise? If the silence makes you feel empty, maybe that emptiness is what you've been avoiding all along. The truth is, attention is cheap. It can be bought, manipulated, or lost overnight. But self-possession, the kind that comes from silence, reflection, and intentional solitude, is priceless. It cannot be taken, only given away. And those who no longer need attention are the ones who command it most effortlessly. So here's the deeper question: do you want to be seen, or do you want to be sovereign? Because the two are not always the same. And in Nietzsche's world, sovereignty begins the moment you stop performing and start becoming. The last man and the silent rebel. Nietzsche didn't write for the crowd, he wrote against it. In his eyes, the world was heading toward a kind of spiritual flattening, a future where people would no longer strive for greatness, but settle for comfort. That future, he warned, would be ruled not by tyrants or monsters, but by the last man. The last man is the modern individual who avoids all intensity. He doesn't suffer deeply, nor does he dream dangerously. He keeps things safe, predictable, controlled. He seeks pleasure over purpose, ease over elevation. His life isn't tragic, but it's hollow. And this, Nietzsche argued, is worse than tragedy. Because at least tragedy requires depth. The last man prefers shallowness. He wants to feel good, not to be good. He wants attention, not transformation. He scrolls, performs, reacts, but never questions. He lives on the surface, terrified of what he might find if he ever looked deeper. In Nietzsche's words, he has traded the will to power for the will to comfort. But against this figure stands someone else. Someone rare. Someone dangerous. The silent rebel. This person doesn't speak to be understood. They don't perform for approval. They are not interested in belonging. They are obsessed with becoming. The silent rebel doesn't walk alone because they were excluded. They walk alone because they refuse to shrink in order to be accepted. And that refusal changes everything. You see, the last man avoids discomfort at all costs. The silent rebel walks into it, not because they enjoy suffering, but because they know that growth lives on the other side of discomfort. Where the last man hides from solitude, the rebel embraces it. Where the last man needs the crowd to feel real, the rebel becomes real in the absence of the crowd. In many ways, these are not just two different types of people, they're two different ways of existing. One is built on reaction, the other on reflection. One seeks applause, the other seeks alignment. And in this contrast, Nietzsche gives us a choice. Do you want to be liked, or do you want to become? Because the silent rebel is not silent by default. They are silent by decision. It is the sound of someone who has already met themselves and no longer needs to explain what they found. In a world dominated by the last man, simply choosing to live differently is a rebellion. Choosing stillness is a revolution. And every moment you resist the urge to perform, you step closer to becoming the kind of individual Nietzsche believed could reshape humanity from the inside out. Which voice speaks louder in your life, the last man or the silent rebel? Let us know below. Your answer might help others choose the harder, higher path. The will to power through stillness. One of Nietzsche's most misunderstood ideas is the will to power. For many, the phrase evokes domination, crushing enemies, ascending hierarchies, exerting control. But that's a shallow reading. Nietzsche wasn't glorifying brute force. He was describing something deeper, the internal drive to overcome one's own limitations. The will to power isn't about overpowering others. It's about transforming yourself, becoming more than who you were yesterday. And surprisingly, one of the purest expressions of that power is stillness. In a world obsessed with motion, more work, more noise, more output, stillness feels like surrender. But to Nietzsche, stillness is a choice only the strong can make. Because silence takes control. It refuses to react. It withholds energy until it becomes concentrated. The will to power, when channeled through silence, isn't passive, it's pressure. A coiled force that chooses when and where to act with terrifying precision. Think about it. Anyone can yell when they're angry. Anyone can post when they're insecure. But how many can sit with their emotion, let it sharpen them, and respond only when it matters? That's not weakness. That's mastery. It's what Nietzsche called self-overcoming, the ability to observe your own instincts and elevate them instead of being controlled by them. In American culture, power is often loud. It's the CEO barking orders, the politician rallying crowds, the influencer shouting for attention. But Nietzsche would point to a different figure, the one who says little but watches everything. The one whose silence disturbs because it reveals no cracks, no need to perform. That's willpower refined, not dispersed in every reaction, but channeled inward until it builds something unshakable. To cultivate this kind of power, you have to break a habit. The habit of reaction. The need to respond immediately. The compulsion to explain yourself. The fear of being misunderstood. Nietzsche believed that freedom wasn't found in having no limitations. It was found in choosing your limitations. And silence, when chosen consciously, becomes a boundary. A wall between your internal world and the chaos around you. It protects your energy. It sharpens your vision. And most of all, it says, I am not available for the games you want me to play. So if you've ever felt weak for being quiet, reconsider what power actually looks like. Sometimes, the strongest person in the room is the one who doesn't flinch, doesn't react, and doesn't need the last word. Because they've already done the hardest thing, they've mastered themselves. Self-possession as revolution. In a culture that demands exposure, where you're expected to explain, share, confess, and constantly prove your relevance, self-possession becomes a radical act. We're told that transparency is virtue, that if you're silent, you're hiding something, that if you don't speak up, you don't care. But Nietzsche challenges that narrative. He believed that the more grounded you are, the less you need to be seen. The more whole you become, the less you owe the world your inner life. This isn't about secrecy. It's about sovereignty. Self-possession means owning your emotional state, your energy, your story without handing it over for validation. And in today's hyper-social world, where performance is constant and feedback is currency, that kind of self-containment isn't just unusual, it's revolutionary. The reason this frightens people is simple. When you no longer rely on their reaction, you remove their power. Most relationships, professional or personal, are built on an invisible loop. I give you access, you give me approval. But when you stop needing that exchange, people don't know how to relate to you anymore. You're not playing the game. And that disrupts the emotional economy they've come to depend on. Nietzsche wasn't just talking about philosophers or mystics. He was talking about anyone who breaks the cycle of dependency. Anyone who can be alone without feeling empty. Anyone who chooses stillness over spectacle. These are the people who become dangerous not because they attack, but because they cannot be moved. They are the still center in a spinning world. And that kind of presence shifts the energy of any room. Think about how rare this is. In most social situations, silence is mistaken for awkwardness. Restraint is mistaken for insecurity. But true self-possession is neither. It's not passive. It's deliberate. It's the decision to stop leaking energy, stop oversharing, stop asking for permission to be who you are. And when you live this way, people notice. Not because you're loud, but because you're real. And in a world drowning in performance, realness cuts deep. Psychologically, this shift is profound. When you stop performing, you start observing. When you stop reacting, you start choosing. You become less predictable and more powerful. Because mystery invites projection, and people fear what they can't fully read or control. So ask yourself, what would it look like to reclaim your presence? To move through life not needing to be known, but simply choosing to be intentional? Nietzsche believed that this was the beginning of true transformation. Not a war against the world, but a quiet revolution within the self. Silence as interrogation. Silence isn't always passive. Sometimes it's the sharpest tool in the room. We often think of influence as tied to speech, what you say, how you say it, how often you repeat it. But in the most high-stakes situations, it's often silence that holds the most weight. Interrogators know this. Negotiators rely on it. Leaders wield it. Why? Because silence creates a vacuum. And people rush to fill vacuums with truth, with insecurity, with projection. Nietzsche understood this, long before it was a tactic. He saw that silence unsettles, not because it hides something, but because it demands something from others' authenticity. When you say nothing, people begin revealing themselves. Not intentionally, but out of discomfort. Out of a need to fill the void. In this way, silence becomes an interrogation, not of the other, but of the room itself. It exposes the performance. It reveals who can hold themselves and who crumbles in the quiet. Consider the power dynamics in everyday interactions. The person who speaks the most is often the one trying to prove their place. The one who stays quiet deliberately, calmly becomes the center of gravity. Their restraint reframes the entire space. It's not that they're absent. It's that they're absorbing, calculating, choosing their moment. This isn't weakness. It's psychological dominance. We see this in politics, in media, in leadership. Think of someone like Vladimir Putin not as a model of morality, but as an example of presence. He rarely speaks more than necessary. He doesn't argue. He doesn't react. But his silence is strategic. It lets others unravel. In fiction, characters like Don Draper or Michael Corleone draw the same reaction. They speak only when it counts. And because they withhold, every word they offer feels heavier, more charged. This is the psychology of presence. When you don't fill every moment with noise, you force others to confront what they usually avoid, their own inner state. That discomfort reveals everything. Insecurity, fear, performance. And the one who is grounded enough to remain still holds the advantage, not through manipulation, but through mastery. In Western culture, Where speaking up is praised and silence is misunderstood, this kind of presence is often overlooked. But those who learn it, use it. Not to control others, but to remain unshaken while others fall apart. Silence is power, not because it conceals, but because it clarifies. It strips away the superficial and leaves only truth. When was the last time your silence revealed more than words could? Tell us below, or better yet, sit with the question a little longer. The answer might surprise you. The projection trap. The silent person is rarely seen for who they truly are. More often, they're misunderstood, misjudged, even feared. Why? Because people don't respond to silence with curiosity, they respond with projection. When you don't explain yourself, when you don't react or perform, others begin to fill in the blanks. And what they fill them with usually has more to do with them than with you. This is the projection trap, and it's one of the silent archetype's greatest challenges and greatest sources of power. Projection is a defense mechanism. It's how the psyche avoids facing its own shadows. Instead of owning fear, insecurity, or envy, we see it in others. The quiet person becomes cold. The independent one becomes arrogant. The introspective becomes socially broken. These labels don't come from truth. They come from discomfort. And Nietzsche knew this well. In his writings, he described how people attack what they cannot understand and ridicule what they secretly envy. This is especially true in American culture, where extroversion is often idealized. We're trained to equate sociability with likability, openness with honesty, and visibility with relevance. When someone doesn't match that mold, when they withhold, when they pause, when they choose restraint, they're seen as flawed. But what if the flaw isn't in the silent person? What if it's in a society that can't tolerate stillness? Nietzsche saw projection as the way the herd maintains its illusion of control. If someone stands apart, the group has to pull them back in or punish them for not conforming. And the easiest way to do that is through mislabeling, through narrative, through assumptions. But here's the deeper truth. When you're being projected onto, it often means you're holding a mirror. You're showing others what they haven't dealt with yet. And few things are more terrifying than seeing your own unprocessed self reflected back at you. This is why being unreadable is powerful but also dangerous. It invites judgment. It provokes discomfort. But it also protects your essence. The more you reveal, the more predictable you become. The more you explain, the more you invite distortion. But when you hold your space quietly, clearly, unapologetically, you stay sovereign. You let others project, and you learn from their reactions who they really are. So how do you survive the projection trap? By refusing to internalize it. Let them misunderstand you. Let them guess. Your job is not to be legible to everyone. Your job is to remain grounded in who you are, especially when others can't or won't see it. That's not arrogance. That's clarity. How to build your stillness. Stillness isn't something you're born with. It's something you build. And in a world that conditions you to react, to explain, to defend your every breath, it takes effort. Most people think stillness is about being quiet. But it's not about shutting your mouth. It's about reclaiming your energy, choosing where it goes, protecting your inner world from being consumed by every minor disruption. Nietzsche believed that strength wasn't loud, it was rooted. And the deeper the root, the less it needs to sway with the wind. So how do you build this kind of stillness? It starts with solitude, not loneliness, but intentional separation from noise. Take time each day to disconnect. No screens, no music, no input. Just you, your thoughts, and the discomfort that silence brings. Because that discomfort is where the work begins. Most people avoid silence because it forces them to hear their own mind. And for many, that mind is filled with noise they haven't made peace with. Nietzsche spoke often about self-overcoming this idea that growth doesn't come from conquering the world, but from conquering your own reactions, your impulses, your need to be seen. Stillness grows when you resist the urge to respond immediately, when you pause before replying, when you listen longer than feels comfortable, when you let a thought settle instead of blurting it out. These are the small acts that sharpen your presence and deepen your power. Journaling can help, not as a performance for social media, but as a quiet confrontation with yourself. Ask, where am I reactive? Where do I feel the need to explain? Who am I trying to impress, and why? These aren't soft questions. They're psychological scalpels. And the more honestly you answer them, the more space you create inside yourself for real sovereignty to take root. This practice isn't about disappearing. It's about showing up differently. It's about becoming someone who doesn't need to broadcast every emotion to feel real. Someone who doesn't hand over their peace just because someone else is uncomfortable. That kind of stillness is rare, but it's magnetic. And people notice not because you demand attention, but because your energy is unmistakably intact. Building stillness also means setting boundaries, energetic, emotional, even digital. You don't have to respond to every message. You don't have to attend every argument. You don't have to validate every opinion. When you realize that silence isn't avoidance, it's intention, you begin to understand the kind of power Nietzsche was writing about. What's one small way you can protect your stillness this week? Declare it in the comments and then live it quietly. That's where real transformation begins. The psychology of being unfazed. There's a particular kind of presence that unnerves people not because it's aggressive, but because it's unshaken. You've seen it. The person who doesn't flinch when insulted, who doesn't rush to defend themselves, who doesn't over-explain when misunderstood. In a society trained to equate emotional reactivity with authenticity, being unfazed looks like detachment. But in Nietzsche's worldview, it's something far more powerful: inner mastery. The unfazed individual doesn't suppress emotion, they process it differently. They don't deny the world's chaos, but they choose not to be defined by it. This is psychological sovereignty. It's built not on apathy, but on self-containment. In modern culture, especially American culture, we're taught to stand up for yourself, to fight back, to prove your worth. But Nietzsche asks a different question. What if you don't need to fight? What if the deepest form of strength is refusing to be baited in the first place? This is not weakness. It's resistance of a higher order. When you are no longer triggered by every opinion, every slight, every shift in public perception, you move differently. You don't chase validation, you carry it. You don't seek power, you emanate it. That's why the silent archetype is so terrifying to others, because he doesn't need their approval to remain whole. This kind of presence doesn't scream to be heard. It watches. It waits. And when it moves, it does so with purpose. Because it's not reacting to chaos, it's responding from clarity. In Nietzsche's terms, this is the Burmenschian practice, not a conqueror of nations, but a conqueror of impulse. Not someone who dominates others, but someone who has risen above being dominated by their own fears. Psychologically, the unfazed individual forces others to confront their instability. If you remain calm while they rage, they feel exposed. If you don't respond to provocation, their performance falls flat. This is the silent interrogation Nietzsche spoke of. You don't need to ask questions. Your stillness becomes the question. Why doesn't this person need to prove themselves like I do? And in that reflection, they see the cracks in their own identity. In therapy, this kind of emotional regulation is considered a hallmark of maturity. But in spiritual traditions from Zen to Stoicism, the man who's unfazed is not cold, he is free. Because he's no longer ruled by the crowd's noise or the ego's cravings. He belongs to himself. When was the last time you remained grounded while everything around you felt chaotic? Share your story. It might remind someone that calm is not compliance. It's command. Become the silent archetype. The silent archetype isn't just an idea. It's a way of being one that you can begin living today. You don't need to wait until you're healed, enlightened, or perfectly confident. Becoming this kind of person doesn't start with loud declarations. It starts with quiet decisions. The decision to stop reacting to every slight. The decision to stop explaining your existence. The decision to hold your ground even when others demand that you shrink. Nietzsche wasn't calling for the disappearance of emotion or expression. He was calling for their transformation, to turn your instinct into awareness, your impulses into power, your presence into something people can feel even before you speak. That's what the silent archetype embodies: the tension of restraint, the focus of self-mastery, the groundedness of someone who knows exactly who they are. When you live this way, people will misunderstand you. They'll say you're too cold, too distant, too intense. But what they're really saying is, I don't know how to read you. And that makes me uncomfortable. Let them feel that. Let them squirm. Your job is not to be legible to every mind that passes you. Your job is to become real in a world addicted to performance. The silent archetype doesn't mean saying nothing forever. It means speaking when it matters, and only then. It means letting your stillness disturb what is fake, while protecting what is true. It means moving through life with precision, not panic. Stillness, not submission. Depth, not display. This is not an aesthetic. It's a posture. And it changes everything. In a noisy world, the person who doesn't need attention becomes the one who commands it. In a reactive culture, the person who isn't easily provoked becomes the one others follow. You don't have to chase this energy. You become it by choosing differently again and again until it shapes the way you think, speak, and move. Until your silence becomes your signature. So if you've ever felt like the world doesn't understand you, like your quiet nature is a flaw or your presence is too heavy, know this: maybe you weren't meant to be read. Maybe you were meant to be felt. Not by everyone, but by the right ones. And maybe, just maybe, your silence is not an absence, but a presence too deep for shallow minds to recognize. If this message stayed with you, even in the quiet of your own thoughts, pass it along to someone else walking the same silent path. Because the world doesn't need more noise. It needs more people who are real enough to be still,